You have chosen a 3-wood. May I suggest a putter?
Oh boy, it's like looking into a living snow mirror.
What?
Marge, is Lisa at Camp Granada?
The Simpsons. If you grew up in the 90s or the early 2000s, I'm willing to bet that this TV show played at least some role in your childhood, whether it was the TV show itself, the movie, the PS2 game, the Monopoly game, the comic book series, or the Simpsons branded, well, pretty much everything that was everywhere at the time. I mean, love or hate it, this show, it was everywhere. And if like me and you grew up in New South Wales, you probably remember that 6 PM on Channel 10 was the Simpsons half hour. Well, that's a lie, isn't it? It was 22 minutes plus ads, and even though nostalgia, I mean, it is a powerful thing, I'm never going to be nostalgic about watching TV ads. Now, arguably, I grew up just after The Simpsons peaked in terms of writing. Most people consider that to be seasons 1 to 9, and obviously I would have been watching repeats as well, but I still argue that there are a lot of great episodes in the later seasons 10 to 16 that I would have been watching. Most notably the Treehouse of Horror episodes, and I still argue, even to this day, even the newer ones still hold up quite well, at least compared to the older ones. Now, outside of the one broadcasted episode per day, I also had quite a few older episodes on some VHS tapes. From memory, I'm pretty sure I had 3 or 4 of these as a kid, but this seems to be the only one that still survives. And obviously, being a VHS tape, they'd only put like 3 or 4 episodes on a single tape, so the number of episodes that I could watch was pretty limited. But you know, these episodes are just so well written that I didn't mind rewatching these episodes again and again and again. You know, I'm surprised just how well this tape has held up, considering how many times I probably would have rewound it as a kid, and also considering that this tape is probably about 25 years old at this point. Now, fast forward a few years, I remember getting the entire of season 3 on DVD, which to me at the time was absolutely crazy because now I could watch any episode that I wanted to, in any order that I wanted to, and even better, I didn't have to worry about rewinding the VHS tape when I'd finished watching it. Or I guess to put it more accurately, I didn't have to first rewind the video before I could watch it, because whoever was watching it beforehand, I'm not putting any fingers, but they weren't kind and they didn't rewind. It was me though, obviously. I forgot to rewind. Every single time without fail. And given the state that I've left my VHS tape in, it looks like that habit, it hasn't changed after all these years. Now, it's these episodes from seasons 3 and then later seasons 1 and 4 that I would have watched the most as a kid, and when someone says the word Simpsons to me, these are the episodes that spring to mind. Now, visually, the episodes on the DVD suffer in the same way that they do on the VHS. They're both only in standard definition, so that's only 480p on the DVD, and 480 interlaced lines on the VHS tape. It's not a whole lot of information, and trying to display that on a modern 4K TV, it is obviously going to show its age. But with it being a cartoon with very basic shapes and colours, it's still very watchable, and I think it holds up a lot better than a lot of my non-cartoon VHSs and DVDs. I mean, yeah, look, some of the text and the character outlines are a little bit thin and fuzzy, but watching these episodes through, you don't really notice after a while. The lack of detail never bothered me much as a kid, and it certainly doesn't now. Now, as the years went on, I found myself watching The Simpsons less and less. I might catch an episode every now and then on TV, but on the whole, I wasn't watching it a whole lot. But even so, with me not watching it, The Simpsons, I mean, it just kept chugging along in the background. And with its 20th season airing in 2009, it made the big switch to widescreen and high definition, along with most TV around that time. I'm not sure if it's something that I would have noticed a whole lot at the time, but considering that those episodes were a bit hit or miss when I watched them, I don't tend to remember a whole lot about The Simpsons around that time. And that's pretty much how it was for the next 10 years. I might catch an episode every now and then, and on the whole, they were a bit forgettable. You know, if it was a good episode, that's great, The Simpsons finally made a good episode. But if it was bad, well, you know, that's just another episode that we can add to the pile of Simpsons episodes that are made, well, just because they're trying to milk as much as they can from the Simpsons IP. And that's pretty much how it was until 2020, when I had a bit more free time on my hands. And to my delight, Disney Plus had recently uploaded the entire Simpsons catalogue to Disney Plus. All 31 seasons at that point. Blimey. And even better, all the earlier seasons had been remastered to have a remastered aspect ratio and had been remastered for HD playback. Now, remastering can be a pretty touchy subject because it tends to describe a lot of different things, and what it entails tends to change depending on who's leading the project and what they want out of it. So it can be as basic as a simple upscale, or it can go a lot further. Objects can be painted out, the colour grading can be changed, and entire scenes can be added or chopped out. And I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of remasters out there that look substantially different and arguably worse than the master it's replacing. And look, as much as I love the look of the DVD or the VHS, I think it's fair to say that at least some level of remastering was going to be needed to bring this up to a certain level of quality to make this more appealing to a modern audience who'll be watching this on modern 4K televisions and who'll be paying at least $20 a month to stream this on Disney Plus. And whilst I know there is some disagreement online about how good the remaster is, I think by and large they've done a good job. Everything looks sharper, more saturated, and cleaner, which I think in this instance looks good. I think it looks a lot better than the earlier seasons of Family Guy, which hasn't received the same level of treatment. Now, I think the later seasons 14 to 19 arguably look the best and are easily the most consistent, at least visually, when you compare it to the seasons that came before it. And that's probably no surprise because from seasons 14 onwards, all the animation was done 100% digitally, which means everything can have a more consistent and defined look, and the lines are going to be sharper and the colour is going to be far more uniform. These episodes were still only produced in standard definition, so that's only 480 lines of visual information, but even so, the upscale that they've done here, whilst it's obviously an upscale, I think it looks pretty good, or at least as good as you could expect an upscaled piece of content to be. The older episodes, however, are a bit more of a mixed bag, because they were, with the exception of a few later episodes, they were entirely animated by hand. So to animate these episodes, artists would literally draw outlines onto clear plastic sheets or cells, and then they'd paint the back to add the colour. And by stacking these cells, you could build up a character and a scene, and once you'd built up your scene, you could then take a photo, and that would be your one frame of animation. And any subsequent movement can be made by simply swapping out individual cells, as opposed to having to redraw the entire frame. That made the animation a lot cheaper, which is important when you're doing a TV show, but it also made the animation a lot faster. Although faster, I guess, is a bit relative because The Simpsons famously would take about 6 months or longer to animate. Ironically enough though, a great example of an animation cell is shown in The Simpsons itself, which itself obviously was a cell animated show. And you know, I just love this type of animation. I think everything feels a lot more fluid and natural, at least compared to the more stiffer animation that we see these days. Now, like the later seasons, this has also been upscaled to HD. Now, Disney Plus is a bit vague on what exactly HD is, but I'm guessing it's probably been upscaled to QXGA, which is essentially 2K, but for 4:3 content. And no matter which way you put it, that's 9 times the area of the original standard definition master, which itself does not contain a whole lot of information. But even so, I still think they've done a good job at upscaling the image, cleaning it up, and sharpening it up. At least to me, when I'm watching it on a modern 4K TV, maybe 2 meters away, it definitely looks a lot better than the DVD copy. The colours look a lot more vibrant, and since they bumped up the sharpness, the outlines look a lot more defined and they have better contrast. But this increased sharpness, I mean, it is a bit of a double-edged sword, because there are some scenes where The Simpsons looks a lot worse than it did. Now, this generally only happens in the earlier seasons 1 to 3, when the look of The Simpsons was still being established, and I believe they were at a different animation house, but there are some scenes where the increased sharpness makes the lines look way too thick, and at least to me, it is incredibly distracting. Let me put it this way, if it looks weird in the Disney Plus thumbnail, it's definitely going to look weird when it's full screen. With all that said though, it's probably not hard to see why an upscaling program or a video editing software might take that low definition fuzzy line and just make it one thick one. I mean, even in Premiere Pro, if I just bump up the sharpness, it's going to give me roughly the same results. But again, I do want to stress that it's only a few scenes every now and then, and from seasons 4 and onwards, it's really not a huge problem. And I think on the whole, these seasons look about as good as they realistically can be. Although there is an outside chance of getting a better transfer, and that all relies on the original negatives. Now, the exact details on this are a bit vague, but considering that it was a 90s clear cell animation, each frame would have been shot on film. Either 35mm or more likely it would have been shot on 16, which was the more common film stock used for TV shows at the time. Because if you ever shot anything on film, you know that this stuff is incredibly expensive, and considering TV shows aren't known for having huge budgets, it's a no-brainer to shoot on 16mm. Plus, once it was developed, you'd then transfer it to tape for editing and then broadcast, and all of that would have been done at standard definition. And in doing so, you'd lose a lot of image detail in the process. So again, there's no point in shooting on high quality 35mm film if you're going to chop out a lot of that image detail when you broadcast it. Either way, this should mean that there are some film rolls of The Simpsons floating around somewhere. You know, given the high production costs, it's unlikely that they would have been scrapped, so they're probably locked away in some archive somewhere. What this means then is that if the desire, and more importantly, the money was there, they can take the original negatives and then rescan them. If it was shot on 35mm film, it should be good for a 4K scan, but even if they only used 16mm film, you can get a good high definition 2K scan out of it. And I don't know about you, but The Simpsons in 4K must just look absolutely amazing. Again, this is all banking on those film reels actually existing and Disney wanting to remaster them properly, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. And that's mostly down to two facts. One, I think Disney probably think that the remasters probably look as good as they need to be. And the second reason will just come down to money. You know, even a basic rescan and remaster of a film will easily cost north of $200,000. And whilst The Simpsons may not be as visually complicated to restore as a movie, you have to remember that a movie is what, 2 hours, 2.5 hours long at most? With the exception of the first season, each season has 20 plus 22-minute episodes, and that is simply just a lot of effort and a lot of time and money to remaster. But at least at the moment, I think we're going to be stuck with the HD upscale, but as I said before, I think it looks good across the board. With one big exception, and that's going to be the remastered aspect ratio, which itself is a bit of a lie because it's not a remastered aspect ratio. All they've done is they've simply zoomed in the picture. It's a zoomed in pan and scan, which I thought we'd left in the year 2000, but no, here in the year 2024, it is here and it is here to stay. Now, at least to me, I think this looks awful, but I think the worst thing of all is that in some ways, it actually starts to break the show the more you look at it. Now, when I first saw this on Disney+, the change was pretty noticeable. You know, even if you couldn't tell what was wrong, everything just felt too zoomed in and taking up too much of the frame. Which is no surprise because that's exactly what they've done here. And when you take something that isn't designed to be zoomed in and you zoom in on it, it's going to feel pretty weird and out of place. And unfortunately back then, that was the only way that you could watch The Simpsons. Thankfully since then, they've added a toggle switch to toggle it off, and I recommend that you go ahead and do that since the remastered version is pushed as the default and they don't tell you that it's simply just zoomed in. Now, even though I do dislike it, to a large extent, I do understand why they've done it. Like I mentioned before, prior to season 20, The Simpsons was animated in a 4:3 aspect ratio, and that was broadcasted to 4:3 televisions. But when you try and display that on a 16:9 television, you're going to end up with two black bars on each side of the frame. And I'm sure someone in the TV network has probably decided that to the average TV viewer, they would much rather see, you know, the whole screen being filled up rather than the two black bars on each side. And if that means having to zoom in on the picture to, you know, force the screen to be filled up, that to most people who really aren't paying a whole lot of attention and probably don't care as much as I do, that probably looks a lot better than seeing it like this. Plus, it also works to make the older episodes look a lot more visually similar to the newer ones. So you can watch or broadcast an older one and then a newer one, and to the average TV viewer, they're not going to be able to tell that you broadcasted an old one and a newer one. Although with that said, you can probably tell that the older episode is an older episode because the writing will probably be better. But obviously zooming in and chopping off a quarter of the frame is going to cause you problems. The first one being is that it just looks worse. You know, we're now zooming in to an already upscaled and overly sharpened video, and as a result, any artifacts or shortfalls of the upscaling process is going to become blatantly obvious. And as I mentioned before, I mean, everything, it looks too zoomed in. The framing is off, the characters' faces take up way too much of the frame, and it just generally looks off. Now, how bad this is going to vary based on the scene, but I think in some scenes, I think it's blatantly obvious that whoever's directing this is having a lot of trouble trying to prioritize what needs to be seen and what needs to be chopped off. For example, in the episode Dog of Death, during the lottery scene, there's a lot of constant reframing or pan and scanning that's happening, and this results in a constant jerky reframing. After this, Marge and Homer look way too zoomed in, and they just take up way too much of the frame. It just feels way too tight in a way that the 4x3 version just doesn't. But that's what happens when you zoom in on 4x3 content and try and force it into a 16:9 frame. In a scene earlier in the episode, they've also had to cut off the notepad that Homer's writing in. Okay, granted, it's not necessary for the jokes that follow, but I do think it's an important piece of context for the frame, and on a show that's quite visually basic, I think these details do matter. And I think it's a real loss not to have them, given the amount of effort that would have been put into animating them in the first place. And obviously this show was known for its small details, whether they improved the show or not. Now if those small details aren't something that worries you a whole lot and you simply want to fill up the screen, I think that's okay. But once cutting out parts of the frame starts to impact the jokes, I think at that point it's clear that we need to draw a line in the sand. Because that is something that does happen when you chop off a quarter of the screen. I do want to stress that it's not a constant thing that's happening, but it's not exactly uncommon either. And how much it actually impacts the show is something that does tend to vary a little bit. You know, some jokes are only mildly impacted, whilst some jokes are completely cut out. I think a mild example would be the perpetual motion machine in the episode The PTA Disbands. A large portion of it is just simply cut off, which in the grand scheme of things just feels unnecessary because there is absolutely enough space for it on the frame. Now there's still enough there to get the joke, but at the same time you're still losing a huge chunk of what is really a cool animation, and it just feels unnecessary because that is the thing that the show is talking about and it makes up a huge part of the joke. I think another small example is when they cut off a part of Ween's poster, which is one of those small Easter egg details which this show is famous for, but in my book, cutting off Ween's poster, I mean, that is instant disqualification. Although in fairness, whoever was doing the reframing probably didn't pick up that this was one of those small details. And obviously, The Simpsons is famous for those small details and Easter eggs, and there are so many there that you couldn't possibly know and spot all of them when you go in and reframe the image. So at least in this one, I give it a small pass. Well, not really, instant disqualification. I think a worse example though would be the balloon in the episode Bart's Comet. Yes, you do get the joke of the sign, but you'd have no clue that there was a second joke just hidden off shot. Now yes, you do get a few frames later in another shot, but you do miss the punchline, and it's a real shame because it's one of those punchlines where there's two gags in one scene, and when you see it later, you've missed the punchline. And at least to me, I think it's a really unnecessary loss because all you need to do is pan the frame upwards for a few frames and you could see the joke. And the more you watch these episodes, the more cropping issues that you'll see. Now, do want to be clear that FXX, who did the cropping, knew that there were these issues because when there's stuff displayed on the TV, they keep the original aspect ratio. There are some frames like this. I mean, even if you didn't know that they'd zoomed in and changed it, this just feels too zoomed in and his face is taking up way too much of the frame. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just going to be an uphill battle trying to fit content onto a screen shape that it really just wasn't designed for. And don't get me wrong, this is not a new problem by any means. Most of the movies that I have on VHS will say somewhere that, this film has been modified from its original version and it's been formatted to fit on your TV. I.e., it's a pan and scan. They simply zoomed in and they've chopped off each edge because most movies, they're shot in CinemaScope, and CinemaScope, when you try and fit that onto a 4x3 TV, you either shrink it down and lose most of the detail, or you chop off the sides. But obviously that was back in the day when we were limited by 4x3 televisions. Here in the year 2024, we aren't limited. I see no reason to make the content that I'm watching look worse. So at least for me, and I recommend for you, go into the details tab, change it to the old aspect ratio. Yes, you are going to have 2 black pillars on each side, but it's a small price to pay for, well, getting the jokes. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I'm going to watch The Simpsons now.